Ooh, excuse me. That's a lovely way to start a video, eh? Good Lord. Um, so back on saddle again. And now that we've got the internet resolved and the health resolved and the schedule resolved and the computer crash resolved, we should have enough resolved to actually do what we're supposed to be doing. So looking at my magic system for my world build. Um, We've looked at priestly cast. We've looked at the sorcerer. We've looked at the wizard. I think where we're trying to go next was to look at things like the druid. Because in gameplay, that's usually where we look at structures of magic systems. Is you have the studious wizard, the natural wizard, or like the inherent wizard, I should say, and then the natural world wizard, the witches, the head witches, and whatnot. Now, I'm sorely tempted there to do it as a structure of Vancian. As much as I dislike Vancian, and we talked about ways to not use Vancian in the previous ones, Vancian magic seems to seem to apply better for this kind of fictional concept, because Vancian is a term used for fictional magic systems that require you to capture something in your brain and release it later. Like, you don't memorize it. It's sort of like getting an earworm, like a song that you hear and then you can't get it out of your head. It's sort of like getting that running on a loop in the back of your head the whole time, and then being able to say it out loud and then not think about it anymore, and it's gone. And so that's sort of the way I would almost consider talking about Vancian magics. It's an unusual system. Like, I know it was one of the early ones in fantasy fiction novels, and it sort of set the foundation for the way we do a lot of gaming magic. So for tabletop games or video games, a lot of it is based, at least in some sense, off of that pattern. You capture it in your brain and then you release it, and then it's gone, and you have to recapture that ability again before you can use it again. And it makes sense that they're using it because it's a currency. It's a way of making those abilities expendable abilities. You can't just have it constantly available whenever you want it. The thing that's different about what I'm trying to do is set up a system that doesn't use that. But in a sense, for say like a troll shaman or something like that, it does kind of make a little bit of sense, where these primitive half animal creatures that may be able to wield magic aren't going to study a spell book, and they're not going to necessarily have a concept of divinities to tap into. To them, like, any bigger creature is more powerful than them. So, like, does a rabbit consider a bear a god? Like, it kind of diminishes the ability to tap into some of that divinity and some of that studious science magic systems. Now, sorcerer might offer an opportunity for that, but that's almost more of a you're born with it kind of talent rather than an achievement to get to. And the closer we approach to this, the more we approach an idea that's different from that. So Vancian magic could provide an opportunity there where we can say, like, no, like the forces of magic are semi-living, and you capture one in your brain maybe by studying a pattern like a mandala, or maybe it's a song that you trap in your head. And we might get into a little bit more of that when we look at characters like the Bard or things like that. But for a character like a druid, somebody who taps into the forces of nature, who helps nature and nature helps them back, and it's sort of like the symbiotic relationship with nature, this sounds more like the divine style of magic that we see in fantasy, but not to a divinity in particular, but more as a system that's meant to connect with, instead of a divine figure, a patriarch or a matriarch on a divine realm, it's more about like an animism as a faith, where you see the spirit in everything as a sort of divine entity. And so the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the city, the spirit of this, the spirit of that. These are the things that you form that relationship, that symbiotic relationship with, and they are the source of the magic. So for me, it's very much like the warlock, as described in D&D at least. So the warlock's capabilities tend to be tapping into a divine patron. Now, the other thing I will say about this is I sort of wandered on this a little back and forth. Not sure which way I was going to go with this, and I feel like it has to be one of a couple of different ways, a combination of a couple different things. Now, one of the settings that I built, or that I played with, and I was a big fan of when I was younger, not that I built, was Dark Sun. And one of the things Dark Sun did was they changed the concept of magic flavor-wise in the setting to be one in which to tap into magic, you tap into the life force of the plants around you. And so to tap into that magic, you had two options. You can try to sparingly pull a little bit here and there from it and not harm anything overly much. Just take a little bit of the energy you could. And so that's called preserver magic. It's trying to preserve the life that you borrow from. And then there's defiler magic, which was full on draw all the life out of a thing and it dies for you to grant yourself the power to do a thing. And that was defilers. And they were rightly reviled as having destroyed much of the world for their own magical gain. And so looking into that and looking into the concept of trying to tap into different types of magic, I was looking at the possibility of doing something a little bit like the warlock, where the warlock sort of makes a pact with some entity that's not divine. So a fae, a fiend, or an angelic being and makes a pact with them to gain power and abilities that they can then use. And something a little bit more like the Dark Sun style of preserver magic, in that they draw their power from their environment. And so there's a little bit of an element of the sorcerer in there, in the idea of, what am I getting a warning here for? No, I don't want to set, just go away. Okay, you're annoying me. Stop. Okay, so the sorcerer, as I built previously, is using a system by which they have the ability to tap into an ability and bend it to new ways. I feel like if we had translated this a little bit more in the direction of, say, a druid taps into the environment around them and has the ability to bend it in sort of a meta magic way that sorcerers do, but the environment is also their patron, like a warlock's patron is. And I feel like there was a little bit more that I wanted to do with that. So warlocks must work for their master to be granted additional spells. So you'd have to earn. I think that was one of the important aspects of trying to use a warlock style aspect for a druid, was the warlock is tapping into their patron's gift, but you have to earn your patron's gift. So you had to build up like a currency. You'd have to do favors, spread the word of your patron in order to gain enough currency in order to cast. I think in this particular case, instead of having to do like spread the good word of Mother Tree or something like that, the goal of the druid should be to spread plant life or animal life, reinforce, build up, increase the health of the environment that you belong to, and let it spread and grow. And from doing that, you grow the resource that you can tap for your own power. A warlock becomes more powerful as their patron sees them as a worthy complement to their goals. You're a worthy disciple. You're a worthy heir to my throne. You're a worthy servant. And they grant power to that person. In this case, it's more of a, we grow together. I foster the environment which grows and grows in health and power. And because I am a part of that environment, so too grows my power. And I think that's a better way to approach it for describing what a druid does. Sorcerers get a spell that they can use as a cantrip at the lowest level, and then meta magic abilities and experimental spellcasting variants to change the spell in any number of ways. The more it changes, the greater the difficulty rating and the more risk of consequences for failure. Now, here is where something I think is potentially useful for putting into the druid. Remember how I talked about in Dark Sun, there's a defiler and a preserver. Well, if a defiler is somebody who taps into the environment and drains it, damages it, and makes it sick and dying to power their own abilities, and a preserver is one who lightly taps without destroying or crippling the environment. What if that's not two poles of a spectrum, just how far you'll go to draw power? So what if a druid is somebody who their ability to tap into their environment is based off of how much it's grown, how vibrant and life-filled it is, and the actions they've taken to increase that vibrancy of life there. But it's also their battery, drawing from it to power their abilities. If the environment you're working on is so sparsely powered, it's very weakly grown and it's not quite wild. It's a garden. It's not a full forest yet. It's not a grove. It's not a forest. It's not an entire jungle. It's just one little potted plant or one small little garden plot. And that's all you have to draw from. If that is the entirety of your drawing capability, drawing too much from it could cause some of it to wither and die and decrease the source that you can draw from. But tapping into it just a little bit for an individual cantrip that you can do lightly. And so taking a set of spells very similar to what I've been aiming for this whole time, with everything's a cantrip. And it's like everything's a cantrip all the way up to a massive wish-granting spell. But depending on how much you tap into it and how much power you put behind it, it can be anywhere on that spectrum. That is something we could do instead of necessarily the damage to yourself of overdoing a spell, like a backlash consequence. The backlash in this case would be how much withering you cause in your environment. And you might be able to build a setup where there's a sense of connection of the druid character to the environment that they belong to. The druid caster is one who connects to the environment. And how much damage do you do to it to draw heavily from it? And how much is there to draw from? Now, that's a little bit tricky for a character who's likely to go adventuring, because in an adventuring setting where a character is part of a party, they're not going to be able to tap into their own garden grove back home, potentially. So I have to figure out how to change that part of it. But I like the idea of planting trees and flowers and bushes and fruit is how you power your ability to heal the sick or other things like that. That's where, like, that symbiosis you have with those plants around you is what gives you the abilities to do whatever it is you do. But for a character like a druid to be built the way I'm building it, it almost has to be stationary. It has to be a character that stays in one location, or in some other way carries around some part of the environment they come from. I think I may have to make it so that they have to carry around a potted plant or some insects or an animal or something from their environment. And it's sort of like a portable battery. You can tap this thing on an occasion, but don't tap it too much or you could kill what you have. And then when you have the chance to get back from doing whatever you're out traveling doing, you reconnect your battery to your main power source. And that battery then recharges and distributes the strain from the adventure so that it's less on your battery. I don't know. I'll have to think about it that way a little bit. I mean, it's a very limiting factor to do it that way. Like you have to return to your grove on a regular basis. It's not necessarily a bad thing, though, story-wise. I just think it takes some accommodation as a dungeon master or a game designer. So if I'm doing this in a video game, what I'd end up having to do is having the druid return to the base they start from, and that base is where you recharge. And then you go out and you carry around, maybe have increasing capabilities of carrying around increasingly powerful batteries as you up and level. And as you up and level, that means you can do more before it's too much for your battery. But it also has to keep in mind that if you're gone for a month, that battery, if it's not recharged daily, I mean, maybe it's a regenerative system. It has a limited ability to regenerate. If you can go a couple days without tapping into it, maybe it regenerates a little bit. I guess I'll have to figure out a regenerative vital battery source. So that's not a bad way to approach it. I do think, for future reference, I guess I was sort of thinking I was done with this magic series, because really the big ones are the cleric, the magic user, and the warlock and the sorcerer. Those are like the 4 big ones. And then you throw druid in there, you get a 5th big one. But there are things like the bard, particularly, that I'm thinking of. We have the bard, the ranger, and the monk. I think the monk is almost good enough on its own that it doesn't need fiddling with. But the ranger and the bard, I think I should probably address. Others, like the arcane trickster for a rogue class, I mean, they're essentially just they're a thief rogue class that has taken up a little bit of wizard. And I'm kind of okay with that being the case. I don't think I need to expand too much on that, although it'll be interesting to see how that works in tabletop gameplay and potentially computer gameplay. Because if I make a system for magic for wizards or mages or however I choose to call them, what you get for the ability of that person to cast is almost an unlimited ability to cast cantrips and upgrade the power takes more time. Now, I don't know how well that translates over to a rogue who has some wizard abilities, because as soon as you chunk it into as being tied on to another class, it tends to degrade it a little bit. So I don't know how well that would work. I guess it would have to be some play testing involved with that. In video game terms, that's a little bit more like, why would you just be a wizard when you can be a wizard who can also do the things that a rogue can do? because that's essentially what you're doing. You're starting out as a rogue, and then you go a couple levels as a rogue, and then you add in the ability to do what a wizard can do. Then, I mean, it's less interesting that way. I did find when I played one of my characters, and I can cover a little bit of that, was I played an Arcane Trickster character in D&D, and my Arcane Trickster benefited greatly from being able to tap into cantrips. I almost never cast a spell that wasn't a cantrip. I think I have one spell that was a sleep spell. And that was, that was occasionally good. You cast it once per day, and that was pretty much it. And that's what the higher level spells are. That's why I'm not always a big fan of the Vancian magic, is because you get them once per day. You have to rest before you can cast them again. I get it. It's a way of putting a cap on how much power your character has. But all the other abilities that my character had, I used the cantrip after cantrip after cantrip after cantrip. Those were the things that I used. Now, having an Arcane Trickster that can tap into all cantrips whenever they want, that's a little more tricky. And then I think that's where you're going to have to set in place some mechanisms for determining how much access to different spells do they get. But I mean, I think the mechanism of it takes longer to cast, and you might be able to do this where, like, I have here the wizard, they get unlimited cantrips as bonus action, a full turn to cast a spell as a level 1 or a higher dice effect. The higher the power, the progressively longer it takes to cast. So if you make that ramp steeper for Arcane Trickster, then I guess it makes sense. It's a potentially viable way of doing that. Again, it would require play testing. I do think in video game terms, you'll have to punch the math in to say, like, okay, so if you want to do this spell, but you want to put more power behind it, it's going to take you longer to cast it. So maybe for an Arcane Trickster, all cantrips are a full action, rather than something you do as a bonus action. And so, like, they're already a step behind a wizard on that score. And if you make that climb steeper, getting them past a level 1 spell, as it's currently referred to, getting them to a higher amount of damage or healing or whatever you get from a spell takes much more time. And for a class like Rogue, that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. A rogue has the ability to hide, take cover, and disappear in the middle of a fight. They can dodge and get away without necessarily being harmed. That's a benefit to them, to being able to get away from a situation, a fight or a confrontation where they'll be at a disadvantage, and use that time to build the power to do a heal or some other benefit spell. I might not even make it a full turn yet. I might still make it a bonus action to do that. So you could disengage as an action. Actually, I think at level 3, most rogues have the ability to disengage as a bonus action. So I might just still make it a full action turn. Disengage, move, and cast as options for that turn. So it would require a little bit of playtesting to see how that works. But so Arcane Trickster, where I was going with all of that ramble, was Arcane Trickster is essentially just a wizard tacked onto a rogue. But like most of the other classes, like a paladin is essentially a cleric tacked onto a fighter. what else we got here? I gotta remember what the classes are. So we've got the different classes in the game. So Artificer, we can cover at another time. That's a new thing, and it's hard to supplement in any way because it vastly changes how it interacts with the system. But we've got Barbarian, which you don't really have to deal with a lot of Barbarian stuff for Magic. They're not really meant to be a Magic class. Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter. Again, you have a few odd bonuses for things like Barbarian and Fighter do have the ability to add, I believe there's a Fighter class that's an Arcane Archer or something like that, where they can fire magic arrows and stuff like that. There's some spell casting ability to some of these classes, but I think it's distinct enough that it's not like it's not distinct enough. I mean, in that it's essentially just tacking on a little bit of wizard or a little bit of sorcerer. So Storm Herald, Totem, Wild Soul, Zealot. I mean, there's just hints, and that's Barbarian. That's very much like you're getting magic abilities, not necessarily a magic caster class. So what you're really just doing is give them an extra power. Fighter, on the other hand, has Arcane Archer, Eldritch Knight, and Rune Knight are three distinctly wizarding soldier types, and that is going to take some similarity to what I was playing with when I was talking about whether or not we could do a Arcane Trickster in Rogue class. So that's one of the things that we need to look at potentially doing. And then the Monk is pretty well covered. Paladin, like I said, is a cleric for a fighter. And then Ranger is distinct enough that it potentially needs to be looked at. And then we have Rogue. And then there's like Blood Hunter, which is another one like the Artificer that's, I'm not sure we're well enough where it fits yet to even worry about it. It's a sort of a novel experiment they've just added to the whole system. But Ranger and Bard especially need some attention. And possibly looking at Monk. I will potentially look at that again. I think I might cover Bard next time I do a video. Maybe Bard and Ranger as a pairing. Monk I might leave out. I might not. We'll figure that out. But I also want to get to discussing some of the other world structuring that I'm doing for the campaign that I'm building, and some of the gameplay mechanics. One of the things I've definitely been dabbling with lately is there's a thing called Session 0, where you start the game with no gameplay. Everybody sits down and discusses what the rules are, any homebrew rules, how you make decisions on certain things that could go either way, and that's for tabletop game. There's not really a need for something like that other than maybe a tutorial level on a video game where you learn how do you use your weapon, how do you equip new weapons, and those types of things. And I'm actually using some of that to inform where I'm going in the future with tabletop game design. But also in gameplay at a tabletop game, you usually come in with a sheet full of information about the character you came up with as the character for your story that you want to tell when playing with other people. And it's sometimes hard to get other people's stories to sync up with yours in that way. Whereas in a video game, they're almost always set up a story for you to start from. So all you have to do is generate your character. So a lot of video games like this, the role-playing video games, have you building the visuals of your character. So your face, your gender, your size, your body type, your class, your race, some starting clothing, and that kind of thing is a choice that's given to you. And that's sort of like, that's the choice you have. Then it drops you off in the start of a story, the same place it drops anybody else who plays this game off. And it does it. I think some of the Star Wars Galaxies, and I think one of the superhero multiplayer role-playing games, you could create a whole different character, and it just, I think, I don't know if World of Warcraft does this. I've never played World of Warcraft, but when they drop you off, you're your own character. You're not Sven the Dragon Killer, just like everybody else. And so some of those do have the ability to just create a whole new character, but it's still dropping you off in the part of the city for newbies that everybody interacts in, and it's sort of a safe space until you're ready to venture further out and take chances to gain more experience and power and resources. Largely in most of those stories where you have the ability to generate a whole character and show up in a safe zone, your backstory doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you were at age 12. It doesn't matter what happened to your parents. Like, that's not, you're essentially building a custom action figure that you're using their abilities for their special class to go adventure with. There's not a lot of role playing. There's not a lot of character story to tell. The story starts when you start the game, and you just do your adventure with it. In tabletop role-playing game, you're a person. You have been a person your entire life, and so events have happened to you that led you to become who you are and affect the choices and how you make certain actions. I think that's the other big difference here is in a video game, you have character interactions with NPCs, non-player characters, as a sort of script. You have a couple of options, a choose your own adventure style script, where you have a couple of options on how you can take this in a different direction. But the script, like, you can sit down with a friend who played the game at another time, and that character interaction, the NPC gave that the other player the same choices, and depending on how they reacted to those choices, changed whatever direction they went on from the one you went on. But if you went back and played that scene again and just made different choices, it's going to be the same scene again, and it's going to be, you could repeat somebody else's trip, is what I'm saying. Whereas at a tabletop role-playing game, that's not something you can do. It's person-to-person interaction. The DM plays the part, the Dungeon Master plays the part of the NPC. And so as a DM, I can tailor my reactions and my choices and the opportunities I offer to the interaction with that character. Just like any real person you encounter in the real world will react to you differently than they'll react to me. And that's not, I'm not going to feed both, another person in the real world. They're not going to give you the same lines as they'll give me. And it's only up to us how we make that course go in a different direction or not. Some people are just going to react differently to me. They'll see this and maybe they got a bias against long-haired men. That's going to change the interaction in some way. So tabletop gaming has to be flexible enough to deal with that. But by the same token, when you're building an adventure or a game that's that flexible, getting a computer to do the same story repeatedly, you don't have an option to be that flexible about it. So if I'm doing a video game version of the same story, and a video and a tabletop game of the same setting and characters and adventures, video game is going to feel much more like they call it railroading. It's going to feel like it's on rails. It's guiding you from this part to this part to this part. Yeah, you could take a V here instead of going here, but it's still a limited set of tracks that I've set for you. And that's more like the choose your own adventure stuff that I've talked about working on in the past. That's possible to do. The harder part, I feel, is building a game that's playable on the tabletop, that you could be the DM, I could be the DM, or we could both be players and somebody else could be the DM. Each of us can play that game at a different time, get completely different results on how that resolves and how it goes forward. Building a game that makes itself available to that type of gameplay, that's a little more tricky, and that's the finesse I need to work on a little bit. So I think next video is going to be about bard magic. And I hinted at it a little bit earlier when I talked about it's like getting a song stuck in your head, and how that affects what you're doing. So I will catch you later for that. It's good to be back. It's good to have the internet working. It's good to have the computer working. It almost didn't work for me today either. I had to fight with it for a bit. It's good to not be working closed shift. And they are trimming my hours back now. So theoretically, I'll be in a better spot to be able to do more videos. And then it's good to be here. It's good to have the heater working in the house again, which that wasn't working for a while. And I almost said it's good to have my health working again. I've had a rough day today and a few other days in the last week, so that kind of throws it off a little bit. But overall, I think we're in a good place. I say this every time, and then something comes along and wrecks it. But I think I'm getting ready to get back on course for making videos on a regular basis again. So I will see you tomorrow. I'm going to be here tomorrow. I don't know what time. Might aim for 10:30. Might end up around 11. So I will definitely try to be here tomorrow. All right, take care and have a good night. Oh, I keep forgetting. It's been so long. Take care and good. I still need to make a master of that so I don't have to type it out by hand each time. Because that's how you get that. That is not how you spell good night. So good. I will catch you later.